my pleasure to introduce Judge Broderick. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning. Can you hear me? Yes? Good. You may live to regret that, but thank you. The only thing I'm responsible for today is the weather, so how did I do? Pretty well. It's a real privilege to be here this morning. Suki told me I had 3 hours, so maybe that wasn't right. In any event, the reason I'm here this morning has nothing to do with any prior job I've ever held. And I've had some amazing opportunities in my lifetime. But the reason I'm in Portsmouth this morning is the most important thing I've ever done in my professional life, and I mean that. When I was a kid, my mother had a great expression: if things didn't work out the way I hoped, she would say, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. And for the last 16 months, God has been laughing every day. It was never my plan, ever my plan, to be in Portsmouth, New Hampshire this morning talking about mental illness, or in any room in any place. And now it's the most important thing I do. And I want to thank Dartmouth Hitchcock at the front end of this. I've been working there for 6 months now. So I'm really here on their dime this morning. They don't have to let me do this, but they do. And they're big supporters of what we're doing. I grew up in a town in Massachusetts. For those of you who are in New Hampshire, I apologize, but that's the truth. And my town had 22,000 people. And everyone in my town had perfect mental health. Not unusual. And every marriage in my town was happy. That wasn't true either, but that's the world that I grew up in. When I was 10 years old, my best friend lived right across the street from me. And I grew up in a middle-class town. And my best friend's father was a graduate of MIT. In my neighborhood, MIT was rock star status. My best friend's uncle, his father's brother, was an inpatient at the Danvers Mental Hospital in Danvers, Massachusetts. In my childhood, every adult I knew and every kid I knew referred to Danvers as the nut house. That's what they called it. Nobody seemed apologetic about it. I didn't realize how insensitive it was. It was just the nut house. All these years later, I look back and think, how unfair was that to the people who were treated or confined there, and all the people who loved the people who were treated and confined there. But that's what we called it. And on Sundays in the summer, my friend's father would pick his brother up at the nut house and bring him to my neighborhood for a Sunday cookout. I was 10 years old. I can remember seeing that man across the safety of the roadway between our yards like it was yesterday. He was often by himself, looking at the flowers by the side of the garage, sometimes walking around their yard. He never looked at me. He never spoke to me. He never even gestured to me, but he was a scary person. He was, after all, in the nut house. And on those warm Sundays, I never crossed that street to play with my friend. I wouldn't have had the courage to do that. And when that man left my neighborhood late on those Sundays, I felt safe again. That's how I felt. And I knew as a child that I would never know or see anyone with a mental health problem again. I knew he was a one-off. I was wrong about that too. Some decades later, in a different place, namely Manchester, New Hampshire, in a different neighborhood on a different road, mental illness crossed that proverbial street and took up residence in my own house, disguised, unseen for what it was, but it was there. I had two sons, 11 and 13. It took up residence in my 13-year-old son. He didn't know he had a mental health problem. That's pretty common. Why would he know that? just how he was. His younger brother wouldn't have known. My wife and I never talked about mental health, never knew anything about mental illness, and therefore wouldn't have been looking, and if we had been, we wouldn't have found it. When my son graduated from the 8th grade in Manchester, he didn't want to go to his graduation. And back then we thought, well, it's a Saturday, he's got other friends who don't go to his school. But it seemed kind of selfish to us that he wouldn't go, but he went. He wasn't happy about it, but he went. He started smoking in high school. I didn't know that. And he was a terrific artist, he really was. And so he spent more and more time in his room drawing. Today I would describe it as withdrawing, but I didn't know that then. He did okay in high school, not great. I mean, I always thought he was pretty smart, but his grades were mediocre. If you look at his yearbook from Trinity High School in Manchester, and you go to the back where all the graduates' pictures are, you'll find his picture. If you look at the rest of the yearbook for the candid shots at the football games, the dances, the yearbook, you won't find his photograph because he wasn't there. He was probably home drawing or withdrawing. I didn't see that then. Because he tested well, he got into a pretty good school in New York for college. And you may have heard this rumor, I don't know if it's true or not, but sometimes when kids go off to college, they drink. Have you heard that? It could be true. And my wife and I didn't drink just because we didn't like the taste of alcohol. So my son didn't grow up around it. But when he went away to college, he started majoring in drinking. That was his major in college. I don't think I appreciated it fully then. But I could detect it some nights on the phone when he'd call us. And we'd go down for some of the weekends, and finally some of his classmates who I didn't know would come up to us and say, we're worried about your son, he seems to be drinking a lot. And of course he would deny that he was drinking more than anyone else, and I wasn't there to observe it. He got through college. He did okay, but not great, not what I thought he could do. And because he tested well, he got into graduate school in Boston. And he lived with us for some of that time. He lived by himself north of Boston for a while. And at this point, he couldn't hide his drinking anymore. He was drinking every day, But he denied that he had a drinking problem, which seemed to us pretty clear that he did. Somehow, he got through graduate school. I don't know how he did that. And then he got a job, and he held that for 4 weeks, but it wasn't his fault that he lost the job. It took longer to get the second job, and that lasted about 3 weeks. But it wasn't his fault that he lost the job. And then my wife and I went to the alcohol experts, because we were no experts ourselves. And up to this point, by the way, no one, no doctor, no teacher, no neighbor, no family member, no one said, do you think your son might have a mental health issue? And frankly, if you had said that to me, I might have been offended by it. I think of that now, I think, how foolish is that? Mental illness doesn't respect your zip code, your job title, your politics. Now, I was pretty ignorant then. I'm not ignorant now. I'm not ignorant now. The alcohol people said to my wife and I, your son, Judge, is an alcoholic. That's his problem. And so you had two choices. You can put him out on the street, hope he hits bottom, turns his life around. Or you can let him stay with you guys, and he'll eventually die drinking in your house. It won't be next week, next month, next year, but you can't drink what he's drinking and have a long life. And so we didn't like those choices. And so we persuaded my son, which I realize now is not a good move, but we persuaded my son to go to rehab, even though he didn't acknowledge he had a problem. Dad, if I didn't have these feelings, I wouldn't be drinking, he told me. I talked to the alcohol people. They said, Judge, every alcoholic has a reason why they have to be drinking. He's an alcoholic. So we sent him off to rehab. And then he majored in rehab. He went to New Hampshire, he went to Hyannis on Cape Cod, he went to Connecticut, he went to Florida. And every time it failed. When I picked him up at Logan Airport after his time in Florida, he was drinking on the plane on the way back. But thank God he didn't have a drinking problem. You don't know my wife, and she's not here today, so I'm not trying to curry favor with my wife. Not that I'm above doing that, by the way. I'm just not doing it now. And I mentioned my wife. My wife is one of the sweetest, kindest, most decent people on the face of this earth. She really is. She would give you her last $50 if she thought it would help you. And I tell you that because she was part of the decision tree, and we loved my son. And finally, thinking we were doing the tough love thing, the right thing that's hard to do, we put my son out. We put him out. He slept in his car some nights. He slept at the shelter in Manchester. He ate at the soup kitchen. He continued to drink. And every day, I was on the Supreme Court at the time, I would drive from Manchester to Concord, and I would think every morning, I must be the worst father in New Hampshire. I have one son who got a master's degree at Trinity College in Connecticut. He's married, he's moving. And my oldest son is going backwards. And so we must have failed him in some way. We must have failed him. After 3 weeks of that agony and wondering every morning whether I'd get that phone call, and wondering whether my son would have hit another family while driving, we just couldn't take it anymore. And so we brought my son home, knowing what that likely meant, but at least he would be with us. When we put my son out, his underlying mental illness, which he didn't know and which we never saw, we saw alcohol. It exploded. And when he came home after those 3 weeks on the street, he was drinking as much, if not more, than he was before we put him out. And I believe that he was scared to death that we would put him out again, and he just couldn't do that. And so one night he assaulted me. I went to the intensive care unit at the Elliott Hospital in Manchester. My master's educated, handsome, funny, smart son was arraigned and issued an orange jumpsuit and went to the Valley Street jail in Manchester. I didn't know that then. I didn't know much at all for 8 days. I didn't know I was in the hospital, but my wife did. I don't know how she did it. I don't. She would visit my son at Valley Street. She said the first time I went to see him, he had his orange jumpsuit on, plexiglass between us, and we talked on the telephone. And she said he was so upset. He said, Mom, is Dad going to be okay? I can't believe I did that to Dad. I feel so sorry. Is he going to be okay? And early on, my wife didn't know. When I was in the intensive care, my doctors went on the Today Show. It wasn't exactly below the radar. I was on the state Supreme Court. My son assaulted me. It's a man bites dog story. It was in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times. My wife said in the early days, there'd be satellite trucks outside the hospital when she left. It was late March, early April. And she'd put her hood up and go out the side door and go home. She said there'd be 20 messages on the answering machine. She said, I deleted every one. What would I have told them? My son said to her, Mom, you know, I don't want to feel like I've been abandoned by my family. I can see the cemetery here in Manchester from my cell. I'm usually there at 3 o'clock every day, Mom. If you could go stand on that corner and I could see you, it made me feel better. So she'd drive there, stand on the corner, waving at this big building. She didn't know where he was, giving him a thumbs up sign. She later said to me, it was a good distance because he couldn't see me crying from there. And then she'd come to the hospital where I was. I don't know how she did it. After 8 days, they brought me upstairs, and at that point I realized I was in the hospital, but I didn't know why I was there. So I said to the fellow pushing me upstairs, what am I doing here? He said, I think you fell. I felt pretty sore for someone who had fallen, but I didn't know anything else. And so I had a nice private room at the Elliott Hospital. Just a thought. When you visit people in the hospital, try not to say, I love your room. Okay? Just a thought. I hated my room. But people would say that. And then one day somebody came, she looked out the window. I couldn't get out of bed. She looked out the window and she said, your view is beautiful. The window was like a 2-day march to me. Just a thought, I wouldn't say that. After I was up there for 2 days, my wife told me what had happened. I thought I had fallen. And when she told me, I was lying in bed, I couldn't get out of bed. We were alone and we just cried. I couldn't believe it. And we just cried because I'd been a lawyer and a judge my whole life. And I knew what it meant for him, for us, for my other son. I didn't understand it. I didn't see my son for 6 months. They wouldn't allow it. He was at the Valley Street Jail in Manchester. And that Father's Day, I got a card at home from him. He wasn't supposed to write me. And I couldn't write him, but he sent a card which he had designed. And I read the card. I was in the passenger seat. I couldn't drive. And I cried when I read it, because that was a son that I knew who had written it. And I knew that I had failed him somehow. Somehow I had failed him. After 6 months, my son was sentenced to the state prison. And I hope you don't have that day in your lifetime. It was in a windowless courtroom in the basement of the courthouse in Manchester. And there were press there. I understood that. Still a story. But I hadn't seen my son for 6 months. And that courtroom was a room I never wanted to go into long before that day. The last time I'd been in that courtroom, I was a trial lawyer. I tried a case. My mother called me as the jury was deliberating and said, your dad was mismedicated. He's at the hospital on Cape Cod. Maybe you should come down. I went down. My dad died that night. I never wanted to go in that room again. And here I was back in that room. And my son was being sentenced to the state prison. He came in that morning and came over to me. My wife and I were in the public section. And he gave me a big hug. And he held me like this and he said, Dad, are you okay? I am so sorry. Can you ever forgive me? I didn't understand it. I said to him, look, we get into this as a family, we'll get out of it as a family. If you don't quit, your mother and I won't quit. He said, I won't quit, Dad. About 20% of the cases that I heard as a sitting judge on the Supreme Court came from the state prison inmates. So my son was about to take up residence with people whose cases I reviewed. That would keep you up at night, too. He was sentenced to 7.5 to 15 years in the state prison. They suspended 4 years of the minimum. It didn't mean he wouldn't have to serve it, but he could have an opportunity to be out in 3.5 years. That day when my wife and I drove home, we lived about 3 miles from that courthouse. We didn't say much. What would you say? It was the saddest day of our life. And we had failed our son. Somehow we had failed him. After 30 days, we were allowed to go to the prison. We met with my son and the head psychiatrist and 2 social workers. We were meeting in the secure psychiatric unit of the state prison. It's a sad place. It's an antiseptic place. A lot of steel-on-steel sounds, a lot of clicking heels on linoleum. Not a place you want to spend much time. My son was not housed there, but that's where the meeting took place. Dr. Knowles, the psychiatrist, said that morning, Judge, he said, I really liked your son. My son was sitting there. He looked great, by the way, and had a drink in 7 months. I said, we love my son. He said, your son, Judge, has every skill you need to be successful in life. He's smart, he's funny, he's engaging. But I'm thinking, well, that may be true, but we're in the state prison, so something's not right. He said, let me tell you what's going on with your son, Judge. Your son is severely depressed. He has panic and anxiety attacks that are almost off the charts. If you had his problem, and I said, why don't you have a six-pack of beer every day? You might resist for a while, but you'd eventually drink too, Judge. Then you might need 7 beers, and then maybe 8 beers. So don't be too judgmental. It wasn't a good choice that he made, but it wasn't illogical. So we're going to try to help him here, Judge. See if we can turn his life around. And when my wife and I left, there's a long driveway leading up from the Sally Port to the parking lot. And I remember walking up that hill that day, and it was more hopeless than we thought. My son wasn't just an alcoholic. He was mentally ill. And all those images from my 10th year in my old neighborhood came flooding back. After about 90 days at the state prison, we would visit every week. And he came out one night, gave us a big hug, and said, Dad, I feel so different. I said, what do you mean different? He said, I can focus, I can sleep. I haven't felt like this, Dad, since I was a kid. I said, well, what are they doing? He said, I don't know, Dad. I take 4 pills every day. I take a pill at nighttime. I'm sleeping now. I'm teaching at the prison, Dad. He was like that for the balance of his time there. At that point, it'd be like me in prison. I said to him one night, I said, I'm willing to step down from the court if you want. I don't want you to be harmed here because of my job. Oh, he said, Dad, don't do that. If it gets bad here, I'll tell you, but don't do that. Now, if my father had asked me that, I would have said, why don't we announce it tonight on the intercom? That's what I would have said. He didn't. He didn't. My son was married at the state prison. Now, for those of you doing wedding planning, I wouldn't go there first. The only advantage of a wedding at the state prison is the receptions are very inexpensive. Coca-Cola, potato chips. We got married, or they did, in a conference room off the main visiting room during visiting hours, and I officiated. As odd as it may sound to you, that was such a happy time in the worst possible place. The wedding photographer was an inmate with a Polaroid camera. I said, what do you charge? He said, $1 a picture. I said, you are my kind of photographer. My son's wife had gotten her master's degree with him in Boston. She later won an Emmy in New England for her work on film and film editing. She was twice nominated. They now have a 9-year-old daughter. She just turned 9. She's my granddaughter, and so I'm totally objective, obviously. But even if I weren't totally objective, she is the most beautiful child, just stunningly beautiful. She could be a child model. And every time I hug that little girl, I think, you are a miracle. From where we were to where we are. My son was paroled from the prison. And I didn't think they would do that because I was then Chief Justice. I said to my son, you deserve it, but they won't do it. Judge's son, parole, it looks bad. But they did. And he did deserve it, by the way. And that day, there were 25 parole hearings. The only one the press wanted to cover is ours. I remember somebody from Channel 9 came up to us outside the prison, put a microphone under my chin and said, do you have any comments? I said, actually, I do. First of all, we're really delighted. My son's coming back to real life, and he's going to go to Hanover, where his wife is working at Dartmouth. I also want you to know my son's not a bad person. He's now a good person. He's always been a good person. He's now well. And those are very different things. And they are, by the way. That first Thanksgiving, he hadn't been home in a long time. He and I were driving to the store. He was in the passenger seat, and he was tapping his chest. He said, Dad, have you always felt like this? I said, what do you mean like this? He said, good, I mean, Dad, like I feel. I said, probably. I felt like I failed him. Shouldn't I have known something? He said, Dad, they gave me an IQ test, in the prison. I knew he was smart, so I was curious. So I said, how did you do? He said, I was 3 points below genius, Dad, on the IQ test. And so I was kidding him. I said, so you couldn't be a genius? He said, Dad, my ankles were shackled. They watched me through a two-way mirror. That's got to be worth 3 points. I said, okay, you're a genius. I think he is, by the way. I know I love him. He says to me all the time, Dad, God was pretty good to our family. If something had happened to you, I might have been in jail my whole life, and Mom would have died if that happened. We need to make every day matter. Let me say one other thing to you here. Sometimes I go around speaking, and people say, oh, it's so courageous of you to speak. No, I'm not courageous at all. I'd be hiding it too. I know I would. If my family story never made any newspaper, or it made the back page, I'd be in denial. If my son said, Dad, stop talking about this, I wouldn't be here. My son says, Dad, I'm so proud of what you're doing. There are so many people suffering in this country who are ashamed like I was, or uninformed like I was. If my wife said, don't do this, I wouldn't be here. My son, who survived what I could not have survived, is a courageous person. My wife is a courageous person. When I went back to the court, my son was in the prison. I talked to my colleagues on the court about it. I talked to no one else. Isn't that silly? I talked to no one else. But what happened in the ensuing years is people come up to me all the time at gas stations, grocery stores, pharmacies. They'd say, how you doing, Judge? You're looking good, Judge. I knew what they meant. I said, thank you, and my son is doing better too. Oh, I didn't want to ask you. I said, that's okay. My son had mental health issues. I didn't see them, and he didn't understand them, and he self-medicated. My son, by the way, has not had a drink of alcohol in 12 years. He said, Dad, you could leave me in a liquor store overnight, I wouldn't drink. He drank every day for years. He was self-medicating. I didn't know that. And the people who would come up to me, every one of them would share a story about their mother, their father, their sister, their cousin, sometimes themselves, on mental illness. I was safe then. I wouldn't judge them. Who am I to judge them? I said to my wife, we're lucky. We suffered publicly, and people supported us. These poor people are suffering privately, trying to conceal it. There are so many people in America afraid of the innocent question. Has your daughter finished college yet? What's your son doing for work? For people hiding mental illness, that's like saying, is Anne Frank hiding in your attic? That's what it feels like. Why is that? Why am I here? I went back to work, went back to my life. About 2 years ago, I got a call from the head of behavioral health, Bill Gunn, at Concord Hospital. I didn't know Bill well, but I met him a few times. He said, John, I have a good friend. Her name is Barbara Van Dalen. She's a psychologist. She lives in Maryland, works in D.C. She wants to start a national mental health awareness campaign, nonpartisan, non-political, and she wants to start it in our state. Wants to roll it out statewide here first. And she asked me, Bill Gunn, to chair it. I told her I'd help, but I didn't know enough people. But I knew a guy who might know more people and whose family walked rather publicly through the valley of mental illness, and he might be interested. So I said, sure, Bill, what should I do? He said, you want to call her up? So I said, sure. So I did what any good American would do. I Googled her first. Oh, come on, you all do that. I've Googled people I've never met. So I Googled her, which was probably a mistake, because I found out that in 2012 she was on Time Magazine's 100 list, 100 most influential people on the planet Earth. I was going to call her. I committed, so I called her. I said, Barbara, you were on Time Magazine's 100 list? And she was almost apologizing. She said, yes, I was. I said, Barbara, oh my gosh, you and I have so much in common. She said, what do you mean? I said, Barbara, I'm 101 on the 100 list every year in my dreams. And she laughed, and I liked her. I said, Barbara, what are you trying to do? She said, here it is, John. I'm trying to make the 5 most common signs of mental illness, emotional suffering, as widely known as the signs of a heart attack or stroke. Now, I don't usually have great ideas, but I thought that was genius. I thought it was genius. And she said, you probably know the signs of a heart attack or stroke. I said, I do, Barbara. Why is that? She said, because it usually affects somebody we love, so we've learned them. And now we call 911. And thousands of lives have been saved. I said, why don't I know the signs of mental illness, Barbara? She said, because most people don't talk about it. Most people don't know it. Most people wouldn't know what to do if they found it. And many people think it's a death sentence, so let's not go there. I said, how can I help you? She said, can you form a steering committee? I didn't know if I could or not. But I've been in New Hampshire for 4 decades, and those of you who don't live in this state, if you've been here 5 years, you know 1 out of every 5 people. If you've been here 10 years, you know 2 out of every 5. After 40 years, unless you've been living underground, you know a lot of people. So I started calling people. Hospital CEOs, the Commissioner of Corrections, the Commissioner of Safety, the Commissioner of Health and Human Services, business leaders, education leaders. Every single person I called said, yes, I'll do it. And every single person I called told me a mental health story about themselves, their family, their friends, their colleagues, about somebody, because I was safe. I wouldn't judge anyone. Then we had to raise money for the campaign. We didn't have a manual. I had no idea how much money we needed. So I did what any intelligent person would do. I made it up. I wanted it to be high enough so it sounded important, but not so high we couldn't do it. So I told the steering committee, we need to raise $150,000. And they all instantly agreed that was the number, which gave me no confidence that I had made it up. And so then we had to raise it. Easiest money. I was the dean of a law school, so they took out my blush land years ago. I can ask strangers for money. Easiest money I've ever raised in my life. First place I went was Dartmouth Hitchcock. I didn't work there. Went to the CEO. In 2 minutes, he gave me money. I went to Elliott Hospital, Catholic Medical Center, the New Hampshire Hospital Association, Riverbend Community Mental Health. Pete Evers heads that, and he's the co-chair of this with me and Bill Gunn. I got to within $135,000 in about 30 days without breaking a sweat. Everybody I asked for money, everyone had a mental health story. Every one. I got to within 15,000 of the goal, and I called our former governor, Craig Benson, who had made me Chief Justice. I didn't know the governor well. But he's a wealthy man. He does stuff below the radar. I told him, and he said, how far short are you, John? I said, Governor, I'm $15,000 short. He said, I'll send you a check. And he did. I should have told him I was $50,000 short. I was pretty naive then, but God love him. Since then, we've raised another $185,000. We had to launch this campaign, nonpartisan, non-political public information campaign on mental illness. So I didn't want to launch it, nobody would know it. So someone said, you should launch it at the State House in Concord. I said, is it a session day? We could do it there. There'd be a lot of people there. Oh, no, it's not a session day. Why don't you use the House chamber? Now, in New Hampshire, we have 400 state reps, just in case you think that's not enough. We have 400 state reps. So there were 400 empty seats that morning, 10 o'clock on a Monday morning, May 23rd, 2016. I said, we're not going to get 400 people. I mean, we'll get 10 people. Look like we failed. We didn't get 400 people. We got 425 people. The Catholic bishop, the Episcopal Church, the Jewish community, business leaders, civic leaders, the Attorney General, 3 members of the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, families. It was the most impressive room. I've been in it 4 decades. The most impressive room. Every member of our congressional delegation and our then governor, Governor Hassan. And I knew at that moment that we had touched a nerve, that my family had not been alone. A lot of families were suffering. And Barbara Van Dalen was there that morning, and she asked this question of that room. If there's anyone here this morning, she said, who's been untouched by mental health, themselves, their family, their extended family, their friends or colleagues, if you've been untouched, please raise your hand. I had no idea what the answer would be. Not one hand went up. Not one hand went up. I said to her later, Barbara, how often does that happen? She said, John, it happens in virtually every room where I asked the question. And she gave these statistics that morning, which I hadn't known. Half of all mental illness in America arises by age 14. My son was 13. 2/3 of all mental illness arises by age 23. More people died by suicide last year in America than in every single car accident across this country. Every 90 minutes, plus or minus, an American veteran, he or she, takes their own life. Every day, every week, every month, every year. We don't talk about that. It's kind of awkward, it's uncomfortable, so we don't talk about it. And after a very successful launch, we didn't have a manual. We didn't know what to do then. And so we waited to see if anyone would ask us to speak. This morning's probably the 150th plus time I've spoken in the last 16 or 17 months. I've driven about 20,000 miles across this state. It's a small state, but if you're doing it like I do it, it's bigger than you think. I haven't invited myself to a single place, and I can barely keep up with the invitations to speak. This room especially, understands mental illness far better than I do. I know who you are. And I know the value of what you do. But we need to change the culture. I have spoken at more than 50 high schools. And when I go to high schools, I speak to as many as 700, 800 kids in an auditorium or a gymnasium. If you had said to me a year ago, what should someone my age, 45, 46, somebody my age go into a public high school and talk about at 9 in the morning where kids would listen to you? I would never have picked mental health awareness. I would now. If you were with me on some of those mornings, you would have to be made of stone not to realize that we have a mental health challenge in this country, that we need to deal with it. We need to deal with it now. We need to change the conversation. One day I went to a high school outside of Concord, New Hampshire. We were in the gym. They were on those really uncomfortable bleachers on both sides. Principal said, we have 840 students here this morning. It must have been 80 degrees in the gym. Nobody on the floor in front of me. So I stood at the far end behind a podium with a gooseneck microphone. I wasn't sure they could hear me. The ceiling seemed like 50 feet high. So I spoke for 35 or 40 minutes. Some of the kids were 80 yards away from me, it seemed. And I was going to stop, and I thought, this will be awkward. If they can't hear me, they won't know I've stopped speaking. That will be awkward. But finally, I had to stop, and I did. And then 2 seconds passed. It seemed like 2 minutes to me. Then 840 kids stood up and applauded for almost a minute. They don't know me. I said to the principal, do you see what's happening here? These kids, I love these kids, by the way. They're the least judgmental generation in the history of this country. They can help change it. We have to let them. If we can't help them, we need to let them. And after I speak, it doesn't matter where I speak, kids come up to me with wet eyes and cracking voices. I'm their grandfather they've never met. But they know then I won't judge them. And they come up and thank me for coming to their school. Thank you for talking about this. Happens all the time. Little girl at Belmont High School, ninth grader with the wet eyes, she told me her story, and then she said, can I ask you a favor? I said, sure. She said, can I give you a hug? Oh, I said, I love a hug. They hug you. Now I see kids with the wet eyes, I say, you look like you could use a hug. Would you like a hug? Oh, I would love a hug. Kids at Bishop Girton High School, Catholic High School in Nashua, in the gym the other day, 700 kids, they stand up. I mean, it stuns me still. 4 kids came up with wet eyes. They said, can we have a group hug? I said, I love group hugs. I spoke to 350 teachers in Plymouth, New Hampshire a month ago, and I said, I know there's a no hugging rule in high school. I violate it every time I go. And I intend to keep violating it until hugs are no longer required from a perfect stranger. Little girl came up to me at a high school on the lake. She was in the 8th grade. And she waited. Everyone left. We're in the auditorium. I said, did you want to talk to me? She said, I did. So I sat next to her. She told me her name. She said, I'm 13. I'm in the 8th grade. And she said, I have pretty serious depression and anxiety. And I said, that's not easy, is it? And she said, no, it's not. But I said, let me give you the good news. You know that at 13. My son was 13. He didn't know it. So that's good. And there's good help that's available. Let me tell you something else you don't know. You're not the only kid in this high school with that problem. She said, I'm not. I said, no, I know you're not. Statistically, I know you're not. You may feel alone, but you're not alone. Are you getting help? I asked her. I just met this little kid. She's talking to me. She said, I am, but I don't think she's the right woman. I said, well, then she's not the right woman. And now I'm saying we're going to have to find the right person for you. I said, but first you should speak to your parents. Have you done that? She said, I spoke to my dad. I said, what did he say? He told me he didn't believe in mental health problems and I should just get over it. I mean, I wanted to say, does your father believe in the law of gravity? I didn't. I said, don't be too hard on your father. You know, sometimes adults are like that. I was probably like your dad, too. The important thing is you understand. That's what's important. I said, is there someone here you trust at school? She said, yes. It was a woman, a teacher. I said, you promised me you're going to go see her today. Oh, she said, I promise you. I said, you mean that? She said, yes. So I'm having this conversation with a 40-year-old. And then she reminded me she was only 13. And she said, what will I say to the teacher? I said, this is what you're going to say. Some judge came to my school this morning, and he ordered me to come see you, and I think he can do that. She said, can I say that? I said, that's exactly what you're going to say. When I drove home that morning from the lake, I said, could I have been in a more important place that day? Could I have had a more important conversation? I don't think so. 2 weeks ago, I was at a high school, kids come up, little girl came up, she had the wet eyes. She handed me a picture. She had sketched me when I was speaking, put her name on it. I said, is this for me? She said, yes. She could barely talk. I hang it on my refrigerator. I think of that kid every day. We need to change the conversation on mental illness in America. You know it, and I know it. Every time I speak, I say to people, if someone has a good argument, by the way, why we should leave mental health in the shadows and the shame, I'd love to know what it is, so maybe you could raise your hand and articulate it. No one ever does, by the way. You know why? Because there is no argument for it. My son says to me all the time, Dad, everyone with a mental health problem has 2 things in common. Number 1, they didn't ask for it. And number 2, they don't deserve it. It's true. So what do? We make them feel badly about it. Every illness from my childhood to this morning, from the neck down, is treated with empathy, understanding, and consideration. From the neck up, well, we're not so sure. It could be you, you know. Maybe you're not strong enough. Maybe you're too shy. If someone said I have diabetes, you wouldn't say, snap out of it, we're going to go shopping. You wouldn't, because we know it's a health problem. Someone says I'm depressed, people say, what do you have to be depressed about? Excuse me, if I knew I was depressed, I wouldn't be depressed. It's a health issue. Why do we do that? In 1960, if your brother or sister were gay, you told no one, they told no one. 2017, you might invite your friends to their wedding. It's true. 1960, if your mother is clinically depressed, you tell no one, she tells no one. Today, you tell virtually no one. What is it about mental health? What is it about mental health that's so different? It's not different. It's a health problem. When I was a kid, my friend's mother she didn't look well. She looked very sick to me. And one day I said to my mother, "What's wrong with Jimmy's mother?" We were alone in the kitchen of our house. We were alone. I was about 12 years old, and my mother bent down and whispered to me that Jimmy's mother had cancer. She whispered it. I thought, why are we whispering? Well, maybe if you say cancer out loud, you could get cancer. I didn't understand it. Some people in my childhood didn't even say the word cancer. They would say he or she has the C word. If you had cancer in my childhood, you didn't tell your neighbors, your employer, told no one. That seems ludicrous today. In my childhood, the only adult I ever heard say the word breast publicly was Hugh Hefner, Playboy magazine. It's true. Nobody said the word breast, and people whispered the word cancer. The breast cancer campaign in my childhood would have been a whisper campaign. It would have. Some decades later, some very personal people said, this is ridiculous. Let's put breast and cancer together, get a color, a megaphone, go to the town square and say, enough of this. 300,000 women, plus or minus last year, had breast cancer diagnoses. The outcomes are dramatically different. In my childhood, that would have been impossible. We've all grown up. In the 80s, when the AIDS epidemic broke out, some of you remember that, it wasn't that people had upset stomachs, they were dying of AIDS. Who are these people? Maybe they're bad people. If I'm in the same room, can I get AIDS? If I touch them, if I breathe the same air? They were ostracized and criticized. And then October 1991, Magic Johnson at a press conference in Los Angeles. Everyone loved Magic. And he said, I have HIV. And suddenly it was not only okay to have HIV, we had to find a cure if we could, or treatment at a minimum. He's still very much with us, Magic is. Mental illness has never had a Magic Johnson moment. And it won't until we say enough. Enough already. You know, when I go around, I'm really saying to people, we need to change the culture of mental illness. And some people say it's hard to change the culture. It is if you want to make it hard. My father was a high school chemistry teacher. He must have been paid on Thursday nights because we all went out to dinner on Thursday nights to the same restaurant. My parents were creatures of habit. And so we went to the same restaurant 2 miles away, and every table had ashtrays, every one. And at some point during the evening, every table was smoking. It was like a smoke chamber disguised as a restaurant. And my parents worshiped my sister and myself as they blew smoke at us across the table. And after 2 hours in the smoke chamber, we would go back to my father's blue Impala. Didn't have seatbelts, by the way. They weren't important. And we'd drive home to our house. And my parents, 2 miles is a long trip if you smoke, apparently. So my parents would do the crack the window filter system. And if you're sitting in the back seat, that doesn't seem to work that well. And then I got home to our house, and every room in my house had ashtrays. Every one. The bathroom had ashtrays. My sister's bedroom and mine were the only two without ashtrays. Can you find an ashtray today? Can you find one? They're not in your car anymore. I haven't seen an ashtray in so many years, I couldn't tell you. If you smoke outside on the Boston Common, it's a violation outside of a city ordinance. If you had said to me one of those smoky nights when I was a kid, do you think, John, in your lifetime ashtrays will disappear? I would say, ashtrays disappear? You're crazy? Look around here. I'll be smoking, but ashtrays aren't going anywhere. That same kid who used to go to those smoky restaurants would watch television news with my parents some nights. We had a black and white television. I go to high school, his kids look at me like, how old is this guy? And then I say we had rabbit ears, and at midnight they had the test pattern and it went off the air. And I didn't know what an internet was. And they think, oh my God. And I say to them, some nights when I was a kid on that black and white television, I would see African Americans being assaulted, sometimes by police dogs, sometimes by billy clubs. They seemed to be minding their own business from what I could tell. And I said to my mother on more than one case, where is that happening? And she was not proud of it, obviously, and she said, it's happening in our own country. If you had said to me after one of those newscasts, John, do you think in your lifetime we'll actually elect an African American who are currently being beaten as president of the United States? I would have said, hey, ashtrays will disappear before that happens, and they're never disappearing. The answer is no. The answer is absolutely never happening. Thank you, Barack Obama. I didn't know the president. I was Chief Justice when he was elected. And my mother had passed by then, but her voice remained. And she said to me, you better be down there. This is really important. And so I bought an airline ticket. I flew to Washington. I had a great day. I stood on the mall with 1.3 million of my closest friends. And where I was standing, Barack Obama was 2 inches tall. I thought he was actually taller than that, but he was only 2 inches tall. But on the Jumbotron, he was 15 feet tall. And I was thinking a lot of my mother that day. And I thought that which was impossible in her lifetime, and that I would have bet you would have been impossible in my own, was now part of the history and fabric of the United States. And by then I knew that voice of Barack Obama, and I heard it take the oath live. If we can change the culture, if we can change the culture and eliminate ashtrays, if we can elect an African American president from the world I grew up in, we can't learn the 5 signs of mental illness and talk about it. Talk about it. When I was a kid, I bet it was true for you, my parents would say, don't talk to strangers. No stranger ever tried to talk to me, but I was ready if they did. Don't get into a car with a stranger. Nobody ever offered me a ride, but I was ready if they did. My parents even said, if you catch on fire, roll on the ground. I never burst into flames, but I was ready if I did. No one ever talked about mental health. Never. We're still not doing a great job. That's on us. It's on us. I say to these kids in these auditoriums, you know why it should matter to you? Because I know this morning that some of your classmates here are suffering. It may be you that's suffering. Maybe your best friend is suffering. And most of you at some point in your life will have children. And some percentage of them will have a mental health problem. What do you think? Should we try to fix it now or let their generation fix it? This generation wants to fix it, and we have to let them. On the back of this card, and I brought a bunch of them, I'd love you to have them. If you want more, I'll send them, I'll mail them. Leave me a snail mail, there's no charge. Dartmouth Hitchcock came up with the REACT campaign. The State Commissioner of Education loves this campaign so much, he comes to high school with me now. He's a conservative Republican, and I'm not. It doesn't matter. Not about politics, it's about knowledge, about empowering people to change the culture. You people have huge influence, and I know some of you are from around the United States. I'm really asking you to help on this campaign. It doesn't matter what I want. I know how ignorant I was. And I know I'm not the only ignorant person out there. I'm smarter now. My family story was sad because it happened at all. It wouldn't happen today. And it shouldn't happen anywhere else. Anyway, thank you very much. I appreciate it.